everybody. It's Mike Jeffers, Chicago Jazz Magazine, and welcome to the feature interview for our January 2019 Chicago Jazz Digital Magazine. It's a pleasure to sit down here with Ryan Cohan. Ryan, thanks so much for coming in today.
Hey, my pleasure, Mike. Glad to be here.
You know, we've been talking a lot for years trying to figure out when is a good time to do a feature interview with you because, first of all, you're extremely busy. Second of all, you constantly have different projects happening. But I thought this would be a great way to kick off 2019 because you've got a couple of projects. One is out already, but the other one is coming out, and that's your original recording, not original pieces and all that stuff, coming out in late spring.
Yeah.
So why don't we talk a little bit about that because you're kind of in the throes of putting that whole thing together right now, and it's really interesting. So what's the name of it? And we're thinking late spring. Is that what we're talking about?
Hopefully,
for coming out.
Hopefully,
spring-ish.
Late spring, second or early second half of the coming year, which isn't that far away.
It's jazz time. Man.
Yeah. So, the project is called Originations. Something that I had started writing a few years ago. That was a commission from Chamber Music America. And I had completed a version of it a couple of years ago, and I was very happy with the music. It was something that I had wanted to do for a long time, which was write for an expanded ensemble that's really blurring the lines of, for lack of a better word, classical music and jazz, or more composed, not just compositions that are just for improvising, but a lot of Western classical music influences in the structure and the forms of the music.
Have you done that before? I mean, you've written for larger ensembles, but it's been more based around not string necessarily. It's, because I know you've done a lot of arranging.
I've done a lot of arranging in different contexts that weren't a part of my jazz work, but but other work that I've done over the years, different types of studio work or studio writing or writing in other contexts for other people where it's not just for me as the artist putting my music out, but it's crossed over into other kinds of music. And I've studied that music, I've studied orchestral writing somewhat over the years. I had a fellowship in 2010. I had a Guggenheim fellowship that was really about my studying orchestral music. And so I took some lessons with Vince Mendoza and also great bass player John Clayton.
Oh, sure.
Who really I learned a lot from Vince Mendoza, and Clayton also really got a lot of concepts of how to organize my writing for a large ensemble. And also studied a lot of music at that time, and ended up writing half of the arrangements for a orchestral project that came out with Joe Locke and Lincoln Symphony Orchestra that we recorded in 2011. So I was writing for larger ensembles, thinking in an orchestral way, which really made me think in a more expansive way of my small group writing. So I had been wanting to incorporate these elements into my music. So this opportunity came about with this commission from Chamber Music America, and I took my jazz sextet and added a string quartet. And that's the basis of Originations as far as the instrumentation. And I wasn't thinking of it like a jazz sextet, like a three-horn front line and a rhythm section.
Right.
I was thinking of it, the horn players, there's two woodwinds doubling on various different instruments, saxophones, different clarinets, and different flutes, and then trumpet. And I wasn't thinking of them just like playing just as three voices as a front line. I was thinking of integrating their different instruments as part of the composition in a more orchestral manner.
Okay.
And then using the string quartet, and writing in that manner rather than just having it sweeten up a jazz sextet, where it's a lot more detailed writing. There's a lot more different pairings of individual instruments as opposed to sections.
Right.
And a very detailed way of writing, which, it was a lot of work to put together. I mean, it was great, and it was a different concept of organizing an ensemble that will think in that manner, because it's not just...
the way you're describing it to me, I can't think off the top of my head a lot of other ensembles that have done something like that. I mean, thinking jazz realm-wise, right? I mean, because you've kind of mixed jazz and classical, but really went more of the classical route with the arrangement part of it. Is there examples of that?
Yeah, there are. And I use some of these artists as as artists that I've admired and really looked up to over the years, like Billy Childs is one of them, LA-based composer and pianist, absolutely incredible. And he's had a group called the Jazz Chamber Ensemble for many years, and he writes for strings and he writes for different. It's not three horns, but like there's maybe one horn, and he has a harp and string quartet, and then he has a guitar in it too. So he's thinking in a very like chamber, a small chamber ensemble. Again, not like in a jazz, traditional jazz format. And his writing is something that's influenced me for over 25 years.
Wow.
Now. He's a guy that I went out to LA many, many years ago just to hook up with him and study with him. And we became friends over the years. And it's someone that's influenced me musically, and just his incredible drive and vision as an artist. So he's someone that in that concept has inspired me. And another one is a great, amazing composer in the UK named Tim Garland, who really he played, I think, most recently, he's been playing with Chick Corea for many years.
Okay.
He became maybe a little bit more known out on this side of the pond from his work with Chick, but he's played with so many great artists over the years, and he's like an amazing classical composer, and then he incorporates that type of writing in jazz contexts. And it's interesting when you talk about jazz, because jazz can mean so many different things to different people. But it's the way both Billy and Tim, though, they're very composition centric, and it's not just they're incorporating traditional jazz forms and traditional jazz history in what they do, but they're going way into like Western classical music too. And so, and there have been others like Vince Mendoza. And several others that have influenced me to do.
I'm trying to wrap my head around. So, like, I mean, it still has jazz elements in there, but there's not straight improvisation because as we're talking, and obviously I don't know the compositional stuff, and you're way deep into it. I'm just a drummer here, trying to interview somebody. But my question is that isn't it just how are there jazz elements in it? Is it because of the chord structure that there's still jazz elements and it's not like a straight classical chamber group? Where's that fine line?
Well, the way again, it's such a funny it's a funny thing talking about it and describing it like and saying it's got jazz and it's got this, because again, like jazz means so many different things to different people. For me, like when I think of writing something that's for a jazz group, it's more about the instrumentalist rather than just the composition. Like you want to leave a lot of room for the interpretation for the players to do their thing. And when they're just playing parts, even though that you might be writing music that has different grooves that are coming from the jazz, that's swinging or that's forms that are familiar.
Right.
You really want to give them the room to play in freedom. So that's where I think of the jazz part of this work is one. There are parts where it's very detailed composition where the type of writing, levels of dynamics and articulations, and that you want specific types of performances that you would associate in a classical performance. And but then there are sections where it opens up when it comes to the time for the blowing, where I go the other way completely, and I want to make the blowing forms very simple. Not where they're trying to navigate a complicated form like it was with the composition, where it might be, in the, when you're writing the melodies and the parts of the composition where it's different sections that are, maybe they're changing meters and different measures, and they're very complex harmonic structures, and the forms are tricky, and you're navigating this format.
And somebody's going to solo over all of that.
Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely do that,
Sure.
But I like to take that part of it and then have it open up into like, now we're just on a simpler format here, and having players that are going to think compositionally that can do this, that they can play the complex instrumental parts, but they have the ability, like both musically and technically, to navigate that. But then they're also, master improvisers that when it comes time for a solo section that is on simpler terrain, they're going to incorporate the composition in whatever they're playing, and they have the freedom to do that however they want, like because they're not it's a simpler chord structure. It's a groove. Like I'll bring just elements of just raw groove then into the
Right.
forms, both underneath some of the complex compositional structures, but especially when it comes time to the solos. Now I want players where there's not a lot of material, where if you took players that are only comfortable in classical music, if they saw a section like that, they're going to be like, it's not,
Oh yeah,
they're going to be terrified.
Yeah.
Where you want the jazz players like to be able to have both that. So that in the composition, there's a lot of the detail, and then there's a lot of that specific writing, but then there's a lot of freedom. And that can be a tricky thing to produce.
Well, I also think it's tricky too, because if you don't have the right, let's just a saxophone player, a trumpet player, or somebody, I mean, they might play the written lines, and then all of a sudden they're blowing like a Charlie Parker solo over some changes, and it makes zero sense. So you really have to find the right meld of who can do both.
Exactly.
And that's not everybody off the street can do that.
It's you have to have someone who's going to think very expansively in the music, and that has the background and ability and interest.
And then also on your end too, because if you're going to write an open section for soloing, you have to write at least some of the changes have to make some sense to what just happened, but it's not going to be the whole form. So it still all has to work together. Yeah. So that's a real tricky situation there.
Yeah, or you'll write, another thing is you might write a cell of an idea, like to get, you're writing a composition that's built off some motifs, or that's going off, into the ethers, and then it comes to the solo section, and they're like, all right, well, how do you reflect that in the solo section? It doesn't have a lot of changes, a lot of times it can be writing a couple notes of a melodic cell or something. It's just like you have an open field, and then you just write an open, solo section, and you just write a few notes, like consider this motif and what you're playing.
Okay.
Or, consider this color. And it can be actual writing of a couple notes or a couple of chords, or it can be just a description. Like, take this mood of where we ended up and, like, just go with that. And then you're painting the composition in that fashion rather than, change by change, like which would be like in a, like a bebop chart or something like that. Although any great improvisation, like regardless whether it's bebop or anything else, they're going to tell a story with the music. But you're not just looking at the music that's going by measure and seeing it close up like that. You have to take a step back and see the bigger picture. And so it's going from a lot of instruction with the music to very little. And then let the players run with it.
I'm always curious when I'm talking to somebody that composes like you do, outside of the arrangement aspect, just straight composing of it. How do you get your ideas for this? I mean, you can't just be sitting around watching TV and say, hey, you know what, I've got this idea. And then all of a sudden, I mean, this has to be something that, do you sit at the piano and like you get a theme? Do you do this? Do you get a melody? And then you start develop that? I mean, because these are very in-depth arrangements that we're talking about here, and they're expansive, I would imagine, too. Yeah. So, I mean, how does like an idea start and then get to the next point?
Well, it's funny because sometimes it does, I think, come from sitting in front of the TV or driving a car, taking a shower. That's like where you get your best ideas.
Yeah. I was talking to Orbert one time. I'm going to ask you this. Do you find that you get some ideas when you're like by water, like you're taking a shower, you're by water because there's, I don't know what it was, but he mentioned it, and I've heard other composers say that too. When they're in nature, they're by water or something, they get more ideas flying.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, ultimately, you want to be telling a story about something, and you want to be writing about something. Like, it can happen all those different ways. Like, it can happen at the piano. It can happen, just doing mundane, everyday things. But like when you're outside in nature, you're just doing something, and there's just music. There's melodies, and there is rhythm all around us. And you walk outside, walk down the street downtown Chicago, you're going to hear so much rhythm. You're going to hear you're going to see and hear so much rhythm, and you're going to hear melodic cells of whatever that's going on around you. The traffic, the people, the hustle and bustle. It creates a mood. It creates an energy, and a lot of times stories can come out of that, or just a cell of an idea can come from that. We have a coffee maker in our house, and when you turn it on, it makes this like churning sound that had this like really interesting groove and interesting sound. And I'm like, wow, that's bad. Like I want to, and it's the thing is like you want to get outside of your of your language, of your vernacular. You want to get outside in an environment that is going to present you with things that aren't already what you know.
Right.
So
right.
that's
because they become familiar, and then you just tune them out.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or you want to be surprised, and then because I think you're going to think creative, like your mind, if you're in that creative headspace, if you have that creative headspace, you're going to hear something that you're going to go, oh wow, I haven't heard that, and I can do this with that.
Well, when did you first? And I want to go back so that we can get into the background from as far as where you first started playing and stuff. But you grew up in the Chicagoland area,
Yeah.
And did you, when you were first starting to play, were you just drawn to the piano?
No, actually. Like my first experiences with music were that my mother was a piano teacher and a music teacher for kids, and she was a really fine pianist. She didn't have the desire to become like a concert pianist,
Right.
but from my grandmother used to tell me back in the day was that her teachers, encouraged her to do that. But I grew up with the piano around, and there was all the master work, like classical music we had all that music at home.
Yeah.
And so I just grew up around the piano. Music was something that I loved, something that I was comfortable with. I learned how to read music, at a basic level at a very young age.
She tried to teach you piano?
I think maybe very quickly, and that didn't work. Like
That's why I'm asking
yeah.
you, because my mom was trying to teach me how to play piano, and that was like, okay, I'm playing drums.
Yeah.
This isn't going to work.
It just that didn't go very far at that time. Although it just kept my love of music and my interest in just a deep interest in the music, and I knew the keys of the piano, and I could sort of play little things. But when I was really little, I was really into sports, fairly more than anything. But I love music, and then I started playing. The violin was my first instrument, and I started when I was 9, and I played fairly well. I played for a few years in the orchestras. I used to sit first chair in the little orchestra at school, but I didn't have the desire to. It was more of a chore to practice the way I needed to, and that I did it for a few years, and then shortly after that, I became very interested in the piano and pop music at the time, and synthesizers and keyboards.
Yeah.
And so I got really serious about taking piano lessons when I was 13, which is kind of late, but I got very serious, and then I was practicing like 6 hours a day and studying Bach and classical music, and was really into it. And I kind of came to jazz kind of backwards, in that I was really interested in pop music, like I said, but I would get deeper into it. And then I started to see the influences of I started getting into fusion, and like guys like Chick Corea and their electric
Well, Herbie
music.
was coming out with
and
that
Herbie,
stuff too then, right?
yeah. And like Weather Report, and
Sure.
and I was really into it. And then I would really get into wanting to expand that language I was hearing, and to get my piano technique stronger and stronger. And it kept going backwards. I kept saying, all right, well, Chick, I want to, doing something that was more on the pop side of things, and then I would see fusion that would lead me more into guys like Chick Corea and Herbie, and then I'd see like, wow, there's this McCoy Tyner influence. Like as the more I studied them, I kept going back in time, and then it led me eventually back to Bach, because
you went way back.
Yeah, well, I mean, bebop, there was so
going,
much
right?
influence, and I would hear the digital technique, that the finger technique of a guy like Chick or Herbie, and then studying jazz harmony a little bit, and studying 2-5-1s, and seeing the connection between 4-5-1s, between Baroque harmony, between voice, when you're weaving jazz, when you're working on bebop lines, and you're working on leading thirds and sevenths, and all the color tones, and like getting just the basic foundation of theory down and technique.
Yeah.
How similar it was to Baroque compositional styles, and
It seems like you were really like into that. I mean, you'd have to be like somebody that's fascinated, and are you like naturally curious? So you just keep going backwards, and
I loved the analytical process of studying Baroque music. I thought it was beautiful. Like people would see that, they would see rules in the music. I saw possibilities, and I just loved just the design of it, and I loved analyzing music. That was never something that had to be like a teacher that would have to force me to do. I saw it as a game. I saw it as fun. And I had a great teacher in high school, so passionate about Baroque music. And literally every day he had us writing a 4-part chorale.
Wow.
And then a 2-part invention. I mean, like an
In
eight,
high school?
Yeah, I mean, like eight measures of a chorale.
Right, yeah.
To understand the voice leading, different keys, different problems to solve. He would write chorales that had he would set you up with a chorale with 4 voices that were about to run into some problems. Like, how do you solve this? Like, because you're not going to be able to move this voice here.
Yeah.
And then how do you get out of this? And it was like a puzzle. It was a game. And
I wish I would have had you teaching me this stuff, because when I was in college and I had to, take the theory courses, I was thinking the opposite direction, right? There's all these rules. I got to remember these rules and all this stuff. But the way you're describing it makes total sense. It's like a game. It's like, okay, here's this. How can I get out of this? That makes total sense to me.
I've experienced it both ways with different teachers too later on different things, but that's really all that got me into composition was like problem solving, and it was fun. And I saw there was this great book by this great composer, and pianist and arranger named Gil Goldstein in New York. He had a book that he wrote, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago I think it's called The Contemporary Arranger. And it has all these different techniques for composing and arranging, which I found interesting. I'm not as into like rules for composing, besides like understanding, like studying like Bach. Like I appreciate it. But there were some great examples and great ways to develop different ways of writing melodies and harmony, and to expand your vocabulary and your mind. My favorite chapter in that book was the last one. He interviews different composers, famous composers, on their compositional process. And Chick Corea wrote about composition that he always thought about it as a game. Like when he sat down, he had a problem to solve in a fun way. Like, I want to create something that's like this. Either that he has a chord he wants to expand into a composition, or a mood, or something. And that's how I got into all this. Like, I don't really have a compositional background in terms of studying at school, but I always just followed the things that I loved. Mm-hmm. And, starting with the Baroque, studying that kind of music, and just led me into different things, and it was always a game.
I think it's because you're thinking of it in a fun way, so it was never stifling. It never went into your head that it was like something you had to do. Yeah. So it was a fun way. It's like the same way people play whatever, Trivial Pursuit or something, right? I mean, they're trying to figure their way out of this and that and this and that. But it's also because you went all the way back and you learned, I mean, from Baroque all the way up through, and all the standards and the way everybody does it, and you've looked at everything. You have such a base of knowledge, right? So when you're composing your original stuff now, you have like billions of ideas that you can pull from, because I'm sure they all start coming back when you start writing things and say, wait a minute, I remember that, or Bach even did that, or this or that. Is that the kind of stuff that you're thinking about when you're putting arrangements or putting your compositions together?
It can, I'll try to start with an idea, like lately, and it's a funny thing, like, you would ask me, like, how do you approach, like, what will you start with, where, how do you go in this? But I've also sort of realized over the years that the same thing does not work twice. Like, you can have a practice regimen, like, where you want to practice your scales for, 25% of your practice time, and then you're going to work on a tune, you're going to work on technique or whatever, and you can keep going back to practice, and when you want to break down learning a piece, you could sort of break it down in a methodical way. Right. I have found, and I'm comfortable with this now, and especially after hearing other composers that I admire, have similar experiences, like acknowledging that it doesn't work the same way twice. Like, I could write something, like I wrote several pieces of music, or I might have written one piece that was very successful. Like, I started with a groove, and then I went into this whole thing. And then I'll say, all right, well, I'm going to write music today. I'm going to start with another groove, And then it's like, that didn't work.
That groove sounds the same as the last groove. Yeah.
It just fails miserably. So it doesn't, the same thing doesn't work twice. And, I'm trying to come up with an idea. Like, sometimes I'll just let the music tell me where it's going to go. You can just start and you can just sort of sit down at your instrument, or away from your instrument, and just, get into a vibe or get into a mood and see where it takes you, and then start developing it. Yeah. And then sometimes I might get into a corner where I'm like, I'm trying to solve this. I want this melody or this harmony to go here, and it reminds me of this. So then I might go back to something that, like I can look back into
Right.
Bach or like how like or Herbie or
Sure.
or whatever, like to see, well, this is similar to how are other ways this problem has been solved, and then from that get a few different ideas, and then try to get several ideas, and then try to do several more that are just my own, like that
Yeah.
are not from that too, But yeah, the more you know, the more that you, the more music you study. Let's say that, because you're always it's never enough. You never know enough, and you're always needing to like do some more research on something. But as long as you're like, no, all right, this is kind of the vibe, or I want to go back and check this out for more inspiration or more information, because I need to, there's some information I still need to like get in terms of I found myself in this place in my writing, and I'm kind of standing on a ledge now.
Yeah.
How do I bridge from here to here? Well, I might go listen to some music for a couple days. I might transcribe a whole bunch of new music, and I like doing that just to see how structures are put together. Not just for necessarily taking what they're doing, but it just sort of gets the wheels spinning of coming up with just more ideas, like
Yeah.
to like different you find another door in your problem solving that you didn't see before. Like, let me try this. I'm willing to do this now, and then it opens up something else.
Well, one of the things that I always talk to musicians about that have accomplished a lot and done a lot of stuff, right? And it's one of those common denominators where they all go back and say, well, yeah, I mean, I've learned all the standards, and I've played billions of standards, and I've looked at everything, and I've listened to the turn of the century all the way up through and how they all play this and everything else. And that's how they ended up getting their own voice in music. So outside of your playing, compositionally, I feel like it's the same thing, right? Because you've gone back, you've done all that. So this allows you to be able to give your own voice to your compositions. You're not copying anybody, because this is the Ryan Cohan's voice. But if you didn't do all that research and back end stuff, and I'm kind of thinking about the younger people that are watching this too, not that we're old, but the younger people that are watching this too, that want to get into this, I mean, it's important to know where all of this came from, even from a compositional standpoint, before you can really find your own voice. I mean, don't you think you can't just out of the air start doing something? I mean, you've got all this back end behind you to get you to the point where you have your own voice now.
Well, I think you need perspective on this music, and the language, this music, especially when you're talking about jazz, and I think it's talked about more like specifically in jazz, that jazz is a language. Like the way to learn this music is you have to understand the language. You've got to understand the vocabulary. That vocabulary comes from recordings, from the beginning of recordings of this music, and how these master musicians were creating this music at the time, working off of each other, and basically defining the language that has made these different forms, like of bebop and post-bop, and how all this material that's being studied in schools, and that's from these musicians that have played, that developed this music over the years, and they, were geniuses. And there's a reason why this music is are standard pieces. Some, the standard repertoire. There's a reason why the music is standard. It's not just that you saw it on a page and you understand what notes and chords are. It's understanding, how to tell a story in that music, and that page came later. Like it was, that was because they were working it all out.
Yeah, you're right.
50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago, and if you really want to understand the music and then have depth of something to say ultimately with it by working and being a part of it, you have to learn it, and that comes from listening. And I think that's just like standard, like I think stuff, or it should be standard. Like that's as far as I'm concerned, and I think most jazz musicians will say this, it's like that's how you learn this music, is you have to listen to recordings and go out and talk to master musicians and listen and play. It's a cultural thing. It's not a classical, like, again, lack of a better term, classical, because I could, different periods, but like, as opposed to this approach of that there's this repertoire that's, like 300-400 years old in the books, and then you're just in the practice room working on it. The best classical musicians are listening to recordings of great instrumentalists playing different versions of whatever Beethoven sonata or Chopin pieces they're working on. But I think it's interesting because there are a lot of classical musicians and students that I think don't listen. Like, it's more common to just
put the music up and just
you
play
practice
it, right?
8 hours a day, and you're just like working on the details, like, and you're not just listening. But it's essential for both, but especially for jazz because it's an oral tradition. And yeah, like you're saying, like the more material that you have in your knowledge base, you're going to have when you are just trying to create, you just have a more depth and integrity of what you're doing. Now, that being said, I do think that there could be a detriment to that too, where if you only rely, or like if you think dogmatically that music only happens if it comes in this specific way, the way it was done before, that could, I don't want to say, I don't know, that could sort of keep you in a certain place, as opposed to thinking in the moment and in an expansive, forward-thinking way. And music, I think, like I've seen, I've talked to some students that were wanting to learn how to compose, and right after I had played, like, recent concert I had played, this like hour-long suite or something. And like, how do I do that? Like, I've got to learn all this and that, and before I can even write a note, and all this. And I said, I don't think so. I think there is also an advantage to, like, you have to have, I believe you have to have that history. That's how you learn music, and that's how you have integrity as a musician. But at the same time, and it is from a composer and an improviser's perspective, you have to have a level of fearlessness that sometimes you could be so daunted by the music and the masters of the music and getting a sense like, wow, I can't really even play. Like, I can't even like blow.
Right.
I'm afraid to even blow anything. Blow into my horn. And humility is important in this. But for both an improviser and a composer, you need a level and you need a degree of fearlessness in it. And it gets harder. I think it gets harder with more experience, actually, because you start to realize the more you learn and the more experience you have, the more you learn that you don't know. And then that can be create a certain level of fear that, like, wow, you want to sit down and write, and you can't get it done in like a day or a few hours. You're like, I'm terrible. I suck.
It could overwhelm you.
Yeah, and it could cripple you, and it's very common, actually. Whereas there is a spark of naivete or inexperience that is valuable, and I encourage students to run with that. Like after that student said that to me, I said, no, like, just write. Like, don't worry about it.
Right.
Just write and just make a mess. Like, write. Like, whatever it is. Don't be worried, I heard this and my stuff's not as good, or I don't know if I can do this. Write and go for it. Like, you really mean it, and make a mess with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of times there can be some real sparks and real serendipity that happens from doing that too. That you can find things that someone who has a deep knowledge base and deep level of experience, and they're always writing from this place of, well, I know I've studied all this, and this is how things are done. Sometimes because of their own it can be limiting. That someone, it could be beginner's luck or whatever, they'll crack a code or they'll open something that is brilliant, or just the fearlessness of it. It is beautiful and it's wonderful, and you can take that and run with it. And then you go back to that 20 years later and you look at it like, wow, that was really cool that I did that. I don't know where I came up with that. Like, if I were to do that now, how it developed, I would definitely take it here. Yeah. But that fearlessness and just jumping in has an invaluable quality.